Thank you, Joni. Good morning, everyone. So I'm going to be talking in this session about the changes that are happening for us as designers under the new regulatory regime with the Building Safety Act and the change to the building regs, and hopefully how you can help us to do what we need to do to stay on the right side of the law. So first off, for those of you that aren't familiar with EPR Architects, we're a practice of about 230 designers, mix of architects, architectural technicians, interior designers, master planners. We're based in the UK, got a broad portfolio of master planning, commercial work, residential, mixed use, and hotels and hospitality. And we've got three studios, one in London, one in Manchester, and one in Wrocław in Poland. My job at EPR is the Director of Legal and Technical Services, and I run a team that helps all of our designers to make sure they comply with the regulations. So we support specification writing, the choice and selection of products, materials, systems. We help with construction detailing. We help with interpreting building regulations, approved documents, British European standards, everything essentially that's required to make sure that our projects do what they say they do and achieve the needs of the clients and ultimately comply with the building regulations. And as Joni says, outside of my day job, I do a lot of work with the RIBA, and quick plug, I am the author of the RIBA's Health and Safety Guide and Principal Designer's Guide, which is primarily aimed at designers to help them comply with the regulations, but does include guidance for clients, contractors, and some manufacturers like yourselves. So what I'm going to be covering in a bit more detail is looking at the implications of the regulatory change for not only designers, but also clients, contractors, and the whole supply chain. But looking specifically at the impact for designers and their duties under the regulations, and how we need to ascertain and prove that what we've designed will comply with the building regs if it's built in accordance with that design. And then I'll just finish off with a brief look at the implications of those things for higher risk buildings. So, the amendments that have been introduced under the Building Safety Act. There's an argument to be made that actually the Building Safety Act doesn't change really fundamentally what we do as designers. We've always had a duty to comply with the building regulations, and that's always been a thread that's run through what we've done. I think the difference probably is that there are certain sectors of the industry, designers, contractors, clients, manufacturers, suppliers alike, that probably haven't done it as well as perhaps we ought to have done. And Grenfell is a clear example of the repercussions of that. And so I think the important takeaway from the change is not necessarily a lot of the detail that people tend to get tied up in and how do we interpret this line, how do we interpret that line. It's more important, it's what's the behaviour change that we need to make as an industry to ensure that something like Grenfell never happens again. And that, I think, is the key takeaway from the change. It's the change that we need to make in the behaviours of how we go about designing, procuring and constructing buildings, but also making sure that we're all competent to do that and we're aware of what we don't know, so we know we need to do something about it and we know who to go and talk to, essentially you folk. We as designers, we can't possibly know it all. We're going to rely on you to tell us what we need to know to make sure that what we specify is right for the job in the intended purpose of what we're going to use it. So essentially the changes are procedural rather than technical. So although there are in parallel technical changes being made to some of the building regulations and to some of the guidance in the approved documents, that is essentially a separate work stream to the procedural changes that have come in under the Building Safety Act. And so the duties in terms of competence, in terms of managing building regulations applications, in terms of managing construction, they are purely procedural, intended to ensure that everybody does the right thing at the right time and accepts responsibility for the role that they play. And that applies as much to clients as it does to designers, as it does to contractors, and as it does to the whole supply chain. We all need to recognise that we play an important part in the process of designing, procuring and construction projects, and if we get our bit wrong, it can have a fundamental impact on the safety of a building, or how sustainable it is, or how well it works at the end of the day. And then ultimately, there is obviously now the legal duty that has been set out very clearly in statute to demonstrate that we have done those things. That we, particularly as designers, need to be able to demonstrate that what we have done does comply with the building regulations. Again, I don't think that's really a fundamental change in terms of what we ought to have been doing, but I don't think it's any surprise to anyone to know that perhaps not all designers have been doing as much as they should have been doing and not been doing as well as they should have been doing it. So now it's very clear in statute that we have to account for every decision we make to demonstrate that we have met every functional requirement of the building regulations that's relevant to our buildings. And then just on the final point in terms of those procedural changes, it's recognising that the role of building control as an approving body has changed. We've got very used to, I think, over the last 10, 20 years of the relevant building control authority, particularly where they've been approved inspectors, of being part of the design and construction team, of being there to advise, perhaps some might say lean on, to get the answers that we want, to justify an approach, and to say, yes, that's compliant. That's all changed. Now, the relevant building control authority, be that a local authority, be that the building safety regulator, or be that a registered building control approver, the replacement for approved inspectors, they are very clearly in the regulatory box. They have been reminded, and they have been given a code of conduct that says their job is to approve what we have designed. Their job is to approve what contractors have constructed. Their job is not to help the design process. Their job is not to help the construction process. They've got to sit to the side and be that overseeing regulator. So that means for us as designers, we've got to get back into the mindset of this is us. We've got to take responsibility for this. We have got to demonstrate to the relevant building control authority why our design complies, why it should get approval. And again, that's where we'll be looking to you folk to help us with that, particularly on some of the more detailed aspects of what we're doing, the specialist systems, the specialist materials, products, to make sure that what we are doing not only works for our design, but also that the interfaces work with the other designers that we're working with, and we're able to demonstrate that to the relevant building control authority that's approving. So when I talk about designers, what do I mean? The statute definition is very wide. It includes anybody that influences the decision-making process of design. So it could be a client instructing a certain solution. It could be a QS. If they're saying, no, we haven't the budget for that, you need to go with that. It could be the traditional professional design team. It could be other specifiers. It could be the contractors, subcontractors, if they're making selections or design choices. It could be manufacturers and suppliers, if they're being part of that process. So you've got to be mindful of the fact that when we talk about designer, we're not just talking about the sort of traditional professional design team. It could be anybody through the supply chain, and you need to be thoughtful of that, particularly when you're providing advice, to think carefully, does what you're saying tip you over from an advisor to a designer, or does it bring you into the designer's bracket, so then you will start to assume some of the statutory duties of designers? And similarly, design phase is a very broad definition. So as soon as essentially, and I'm going to show my age and say pen is put to paper, but clearly once modelling starts now in the digital sphere, that design is starting. That's the start of your design phase, and it doesn't end until the very last element to be built is designed. So there is clearly on many projects going to be a total overlap between stage 4 technical design and stage 5 construction. So this idea that as soon as you start on site, that's the end of design, it's not true. Particularly where there's contractor design, there will always be this concurrency. So everybody needs to keep in mind that that design process, those design duties carry on right through to the last moment of a project, and certainly in terms of all the regulated requirements. And what we need to be mindful of as well is that there are now there's a much stronger prescription in terms of what we need to do in terms of that design to get that approved before it's constructed. Now, we've got a very strict regime for high-risk buildings, which we'll touch on later, but it applies to all projects. And that's that we need to make sure that anything that's going to be built has been properly designed and considered and specified and has been approved before it's built. So no more of this, oh, well, we know you specified this, but actually we've got somebody on site, they're just about to do it, and we're going to change it, and that's all right, isn't it? No, that's no longer going to work. We've got to have sufficient time to make sure we can consider if there is change, we need to fully address that change, make sure we're still within the approval process, and make sure that's consented before we construct. And as part of that, we need to be able to demonstrate as designers not only what we have designed, but how we've designed it in terms of what's the guidance we've followed, what's the advice we've sought, how have we sought to achieve that functional requirement, and why. So we need to explain why we've done something, so if there is a change, everybody understands the implications of that change, and they don't have those changes don't have an unintended consequence that then undermines something else on the rest of the building. So we need to make sure the building works as a system when we get that approval, and any change to any parts of that system don't undermine the building as a whole. And for that, we need to produce clear, concise, comprehensive design information. And for that, we will need your assistance with clear, concise, comprehensive information from you. And we'll come on to that in a bit more in a moment. But probably the last point on this is to say that we're already starting to see a shift in how we are asked to do our design, how clients are expecting us to address design and document design. We're already seeing a push away from descriptive specifications to far more prescriptive specifications. We're seeing clients say, I want you to make those decisions early on. I want you to engage with the supply chain because I don't want the delays, I don't want the hassle later on. I don't want my construction process to be held up with last-minute changes that are going to disrupt the procurement or the construction. So I know there's mixed feelings on that approach, and I'm sure we'll probably have some questions and debate about that later, but that's certainly what we're already seeing very much in the early days of this change. So clients are looking for certainty. They ultimately, under their duties, have to sign off compliance. You know, for the first time in their lives, I'm getting clients say, what is a functional requirement? You know, arguably, they probably should have known that before. Maybe we should have advised them before, but now we're certainly getting the questions. And the fact that they're engaging and they're realizing they've got to get this right, because if they don't, they're going to be held to account by the regulator. And certainly with many of the clients that we're working with, they've got no intention of being the first client that's hauled across the coals by the regulator to say, you didn't do this properly. So they're very mindful of how the process and the behaviours need to change. So what do we need from the supply chain? What do we need from you folks? We need to make sure that when we're designing, we can assess the compliance with the functional requirements of the building regulations. So the functional requirements A through to T. So we can say, yes, what we've designed is structurally sound. Yes, what we've designed is going to meet the fire performance that's going to prevent spread of flame. Yes, what we've designed is going to meet the requirements of Part E in terms of acoustic performance, in terms of thermal performance, and all those things. But we can only do that with access to reliable, concise, useful information. So we're looking to the supply chain to provide us with information that says, yes, this product, this material, this system performs to this standard in compliance with those functional requirements. But equally, to let us know it's not right for this. It's not right for this purpose. We've seen your design and we think you've selected the wrong thing. But here's something that works for you. You know, we want to have that level of engagement at the early days to say, right, this is what we're intending, this is our design intent, this is what we're trying to achieve. So you can come to us and say, well, this is what we can offer you. So we can look at it, we can engage with, hopefully, the contracting supply chain as well, and get that whole consensus of this is the right thing to be doing and this is why. And we know that this product, this system, this material is going to work with this product next to it. These interfaces are going to work. So we don't have this fragmented, one designer doing this over here, one designer doing that over there, bring everything together at the last minute. And all of a sudden, we find that those products aren't compatible with each other. So we need that level of input and information far earlier in the design process. But we need that information to be reliable. You know, I'm sure you're all well aware of the findings of the public inquiry from Grenfell and the repercussions of that. We obviously now are very nervous about how much interrogation do we need to do of the information that we're provided with. How much can we rely on that information that we're provided? But we need from you that confidence that says, yes, we've got our product, yes, it performs to this standard, and it's not just us saying it, we've had somebody else independently look at it, test it for us, and say, this is what it does in this scenario. So again, the field of application is extremely important. We need to know what any product material system does, but equally we need to know what it doesn't do. Where is it appropriate for use, but also where is it not appropriate for use? And also, if that changes, let us know. We know, obviously, there's product development, there's things that change, testing regimes change. We know that certification changes. So let us know. Make sure there's a good way of quality assuring what information we're given, when we're given it, so there's version control so we can see if something changes. And when something changes, let us know. Make it publicly available so we can say, okay, that has changed. Do we need to reassess the use of this product system material? Do we need to think again? Is there a change that we need to make? Now, that doesn't mean that we need to see everything that's gone on in the past. We don't need to be party to product development, to confidential information. You know, there's lots of debates about should test failures be in the public domain. My personal view is not necessarily, unless you feel it has a material impact on the potential use of your products and materials. If it does, then yes, part of your behavioural change is to take the responsible position and tell people. Yes, it might have an impact on the bottom line, but ultimately, isn't it better that than we can address it than we have another Grenfell and people die? And that's ultimately what we've got to be considering every step of the process. And aligned with that, we'd like access to you guys. There seems to be a strange thing that nobody wants to pick up the phone anymore. I remember when I was a junior architect, most of my time was on the phone asking questions, finding out about stuff. Now it's this whole, well, it's on the website, just look at the website. Yes, that's useful. Yes, that's helpful. But actually, I want to talk to somebody. I want to explain, this is what I'm trying to do. I think what you're providing works, but I'm not quite sure. Or I've seen your test certificate, I think it's right, but I'm not quite sure I understand what it says. Can I speak to somebody that knows? And what we need is technically competent people that we can talk to, that can come in and talk to our staff, that can give us presentations about what you can offer. And that's not just, we love the pretty pictures, don't get me wrong, I'm an architect, I'm always seduced by a pretty picture and an image, but we need to know the nuts and bolts as well. We need the hard facts, we need the text, we need that content. And so that's what we ask from you guys, is to make sure that's available and it's readily available at the point we need to use it. So we can build the relationships with you so that if something does need to change, we know who to talk to. And we can talk through that change and say, we know we spoke about this previously, but this has now happened. Can you help us to resolve this or change it? Or is it still fine? Are we worrying unnecessarily? And so that then brings me just then to the detail of product declarations. Great stuff. I know architects really love them, not. They really understand them, not. So again, this is where we need your help to say, right, this is what we're saying about what we're providing. But most importantly, where you're silent, why are you silent? Why is there a gap in the information? Is it just not relevant? Is it that the performance can't be determined? If so, why? What do we need to know to help us to make, again, the right decisions? Now, lots of people say, well, if we tell you that, then you're not going to use your product. Often you'll find the opposite is true. You will build confidence with us as designers and specifiers if you tell us the things we don't necessarily want to hear, the bad news, as much as the good news. If we know what doesn't work as well as we know what does work, we'll have confidence that we're using the right product in the right place. And I probably shouldn't say this, but architects are inherently lazy. And if they've got something they know works, and they've got a supplier that knows will work with them, that'll be the easier choice to go to next time. So again, building those relationships is fundamental, because then we're like, there's somebody I know I can work with, somebody I know I can ask the questions of, I'm going to go back to them again. And it's important to bear that in mind. And that's why, I always say to our architects, our job is to tell our clients the things they don't necessarily want to hear as much as what they do want to hear. And it's the same for us as designers. We need to hear the things that we don't necessarily want to hear as much as the things we do want to. And again, clear statements about what your product does, but also ideally standardized statements. What we want to be able to do is to put products and materials side by side to be able to compare them, to say, right, yes, we've got all these options, that's brilliant, but which are the best options? I can go onto any retailer's website and say I want to buy something, and before I know it, I've got 50 other options of, you've looked at this, here's the similar things. And I can quickly see how they all compare to each other. Why can't I do that in my day job? Why can't I do that when I'm looking to specify a material? That should be there, it should be available. And this is a plea to industry, say, get together. Part of the responsibility change is greater collaboration. It's working more together to make sure we're doing the right thing. And if your product is good as you say it is, you shouldn't be worried about putting yourself alongside competitors. We need to see it so we can say the why of our regulatory compliance. We've picked this over these because of this. This is why it's the right thing for us to specify. And then ultimately, we need to get that information down, we need to get that recorded, and we need to get that information in a way that we can communicate it to our clients, we can communicate it to the contractor, and more importantly, nowadays, we can communicate it to the building owners, the occupiers. Bearing in mind, many of those might be residential owner-occupiers, tenants. So they need easy, accessible, legible information. Now, that doesn't need to be everything, but the most important stuff needs to be there, and it needs to be in plain English. So we can use that, particularly where we're on high-risk buildings, where we're going to be putting that information into the golden thread. Which brings me nicely on to the aspects for higher risk buildings. Now, hopefully you are all familiar with the definition of high risk building, which currently is residential buildings with more than one residential unit, so 2 units or more, over 18 metres, including for the design and construction phase, care homes and hospitals. The Grenfell Public Inquiry has recommended that that definition is changed. They found that using a height limit is an arbitrary limit and really does have no bearing on whether a building and the occupants of it are at risk or not. So there is a lot of discussion at the moment within industry about how that definition could or might or should change. And the reality is it's probably going to be based on the users of the building and a definition of what a vulnerable user will be. And that essentially means that all residential properties could fall under the high-risk building definition. So whilst at the moment high-risk buildings are a relatively small proportion of building work, although I think lots of people would argue that with the way the regulator's dealing with them at the moment, is a small portion of what we do, there is the potential that that scope could broaden very rapidly. So these new aspects that relate to high-risk buildings could apply to a lot more buildings in the near future. So for those buildings, the regulator, the building safety regulator, the HSE, is now the relevant building control authority. There is no choice about that. And I don't think it's any secret, and the HSE has been quite open to say that so far, the majority of applications that have been submitted to the regulator for approval aren't good enough. They haven't contained sufficient information, they haven't contained the right information, and they haven't met that requirement to justify the what, the why, and the how. And from what I'm hearing anecdotally, a lot of that is happening because at the moment, the engagement from stage 3 through to the end of stage 4 with the supply chain hasn't been good enough. It hasn't been robust enough. So too much is still being left to say, well, give us approval for this and we'll deal with that bit later. And the regulators say, no, not good enough. We've told you your behaviour needs to change. We've told you we need to see this information to approve it before you can start constructing on site. So already we are seeing a major impact on construction programmes for high-risk buildings. And as a response, like I said earlier, clients are already saying, okay, we don't want this to happen in our project. We want to make sure that when we put our Gateway 2 application in, it is as complete as we can possibly make it. Now, that's obviously harder for buildings where we're working with an existing building and we need a certain amount of information and opening up. So there's issues there. But certainly for new builds, clients are saying, we want everything designed. We want you engaging. They are pulling in contractors early days. We're seeing a lot more pre-contract services agreements and actually being used properly for once, not just to cut the cost of the project and get the tender price down, but to actually get involved with the design to make better decisions, to make sure there's certainty through that construction phase. So we're already seeing that change. And likewise, the impact of statutory change control. So once we get our Gateway 2 approval, any change after that point needs to be recorded. And then of those recorded changes, some need to be notified to the regulator, but more importantly, some changes which are deemed to be major changes need to get approval from the regulator before work proceeds. So that essentially means any changes through the construction phase could have an untold impact on the programme. There's supposed to be an 8-week statutory approval process for major changes, but as we've already seen, that approval period is not being met for the Gateway 2 application, so it's questionable whether it will be met for change approvals as well. So if that means work has to stop on site, I'm sure you'll know, there's obviously impacts, delays, costs, the whole procurement goes out. Clients don't want that risk. So again, clients are saying to us, make sure you've got everything fixed and certain so we don't have that change later on, or we limit the risk of change. And again, that's where we rely on information from you to make sure there's that version control. So if something changes in your product so it is no longer available in the way we specified it, we need to know as soon as possible so we can make those anticipatory changes and those anticipatory approval applications before it has an impact on site. You know, we've got to be more diligent about monitoring what we've designed before it gets built, but we need you to be more diligent, say, this is change, we know this has been specified on this project, we need to be in touch with the project team to let them know there's been a change and there's potential impact. And then the final point is the golden thread information that I touched on previously. We now need to make sure that from the point of approval, all of the information that we've submitted for approval goes into the golden thread, and then that information is maintained through the construction phase so it's ready to hand over prior to occupation of that building. But that means that we need clear, concise, relevant information that's well organised and accessible in a digital format so we can help the client manage that golden thread, manage changes to the golden thread, so it is in the appropriate format and it is accessible to those that need to use it at the end of the day once they take occupation of their building. So I think in summary, I don't think there's anything different, I say, to what we've done in the past. I think it's just a case of we all collectively need to do it better. We all need to play our part in working and communicating better with each other to make sure that we're recognising the responsibility we each have individually, but also collectively, to be part of that process of design, procurement and construction, to make sure that the buildings we design, that we build, are safe, accessible, sustainable, and as best quality as we can make them. Forever the optimist. Thank you.